What kind of person demands to be treated like royalty in a room where only 3 people are present? That's the question that slices straight down the center of this entire story. A story that starts quietly, awkwardly, almost comically, yet spirals into something far more revealing about Meghan Markle, about power, about identity, and about the one thing she simply cannot afford to lose: control. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because make no mistake, this wasn't just an interview. This wasn't just a magazine shoot or a polite sit-down between a writer and a global celebrity. This was a performance, a ritual, a stage. And Meghan Markle expected everyone in that room to know their lines. Except one person refused to play along. Before we get there, let's pause for a moment. Let me ask you something directly. If someone insists on being introduced by their full title in an empty room, what does that actually say about them? Is it confidence or insecurity? Is it power or fragility? Is it royalty or just the illusion of it? Hold those questions, because by the end of this story, your answers will change. But for now, picture this scene. New York City. A private residence, rented for the day. Polished floors, curated flower arrangements, a faint smell of luxury candle wax lingering in the air. The kind of place where every item is placed deliberately, where nothing is accidental, where image is everything. A house manager stands by the door, rehearsing a line that no one in America ever expects to say out loud. Across the room, Meghan Markle sits with perfectly measured posture, her expression cool, composed, prepared. Not relaxed. Prepared. The door opens. Journalist Kaitlyn Greenidge steps inside, a notebook in one hand, a recorder in the other. Neutral expression. Professional. Ready. And then, it happens. A voice slices through the silence. Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. Announced as if a ballroom were full, as if cameras were flashing, as if royalty had arrived. Except it was just them. 3 people. A house manager, Meghan Markle, and Kaitlyn Greenidge. Why announce her like that? Why insist on the theatrics? Why recreate Buckingham Palace energy inside a Manhattan apartment? Better question, who was that announcement really for? Because it wasn't for Kaitlyn. She already knew who she was interviewing. It wasn't for the public. No cameras were rolling. It wasn't for the house manager. He'd probably rehearsed it 5 times already. So who was it meant to impress? Here's where the story digs deeper. Here's where things get uncomfortable. Here's where the contradictions begin to surface. Because Meghan has spent years telling the world she stepped away from royal life, that she wanted privacy, freedom, independence, her own voice. Yet in moments like this, moments when no one is watching, she clings to the trappings of royalty with a ferocity that surprises even seasoned journalists. Maybe even scares them. And Kaitlyn Greenidge? She's not just any journalist. She's sharp, experienced, culturally aware, unafraid of nuance and unpersuaded by theatrics. She walks into that room expecting a conversation. Meghan expects obedience. It's a mismatch from the start. But before we break down the moment where everything explodes, let's step back and ask another question. Why does this story matter now? Why is this interview, this single awkward encounter in a private room, resurfacing with such force? Why does this particular detail cut so sharply through Meghan's carefully crafted public image? Because it exposes something raw, something many people have suspected but few have articulated clearly, something that tells us more about Meghan's relationship with power, identity, and self-image than any Netflix documentary, any podcast, or any stage public appearance. And it comes down to one word: titles. Her title isn't just an accessory. It isn't just a leftover from royal history. It's the foundation of her brand, the thing that lifts her above being just another celebrity. The one part of her life she can't let go of, even when she tells the world she already has. So when Kaitlyn Greenidge didn't use it, didn't say it, didn't bow to it, everything unraveled. Now, here's where the timing becomes crucial. Because this didn't happen years ago. It isn't an old rumor. It isn't one of those dusty stories whispered around royal reporters. This is fresh, current, a new data point in the unfolding saga of Meghan Markle's relationship with the press. Especially the American press, who don't operate under royal protocol and don't care about titles the way the British system does. And what makes this moment so fascinating is the dynamic. Meghan wants to be treated like royalty, but also like a celebrity, like an activist, but also like an icon, like a woman embracing freedom, but also like a figure shrouded in hierarchy. She wants informality when it benefits her, formality when it elevates her, privacy until she wants visibility, visibility until she wants privacy. Everything is conditional. Everything is flexible. Everything is strategic. But not Kaitlyn. Not this time. Because when the house manager announced, Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, Kaitlyn simply smiled politely. She didn't bow. She didn't gasp. She didn't react with awe or deference. She said, "Hi, Meghan." And in that instant, in those two quiet words, something inside the room cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Meghan's face twitched. A micro-reaction, but a telling one. A split-second flash of irritation, disbelief, maybe even insult. Why? Because in her mind, this wasn't just a greeting. It was a challenge, a refusal, a reminder that here, in America, in this apartment, during this interview, she wasn't a duchess. She was a public figure, one of many, not above, not untouchable, not your highness. And this is where curiosity spikes. This is where the audience leans in. Because if one greeting could rattle Meghan this much, what would happen next? What exactly did she say? What demand did she make? What line did Kaitlyn refuse to cross? And why? Most importantly, why has Meghan's relationship with her title become such a sore spot? To understand any of this, we must look at the environment Meghan built inside that private room. The curated flowers, the staged seating, the choreographed entrance, the formal announcement by the house manager. An announcement that served no practical purpose except to reinforce hierarchy. It's one thing to perform royalty in front of cameras. It's another to perform it in a nearly empty room. That's the piece of this story that sticks with people. The image of Meghan sitting there, waiting to be introduced like a queen in a palace, when the palace was an Airbnb and the audience was a journalist and a house manager. There's a loneliness to that visual, a desperation, a longing to hold on to something fragile. But here's where the contradiction sharpens. Meghan claims she escaped the suffocating environment of royal protocol, that she freed herself from titles, ranks, expectations, and formalities. Yet here she is, recreating them. Why? Is this insecurity? Is this branding? Is this ego? Is this survival? Or is it all of the above? And so the stage is set. Meghan, perched in her chair like a queen without a throne. Kaitlyn, leveling the energy in the room with a simple, "Hi, Meghan." A house manager frozen, sensing the tension but unsure what to do next. It's the beginning of a slow-burn confrontation, a clash of two worlds that were never meant to coexist. Royal protocol meets American directness. A duchess meets a journalist who doesn't bend. And believe it or not, this was only the opening moment. Because what happened after this greeting makes the introduction look calm, civil, almost peaceful. Because the real explosion happened when Meghan decided Kaitlyn needed a correction, a reminder, a verbal nudge to put her back in her place. And that moment, that single exchange, is what sent shockwaves through the media world. But before we get there, before we get to the confrontation itself, let me leave you with this. If Meghan truly wanted to step away from the royal world, if she truly wanted to be free of protocol, if she truly wanted to reinvent herself, why is she still fighting so hard to keep the title alive? Hold that question, because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What kind of room goes silent before anything even happens? That's the question that hangs in the air the moment we pick up from that cliffhanger. The moment when Meghan Markle's entire world of carefully maintained protocol collided with the blunt force of an American journalist who simply refused to play along. And here's the real mystery. Why did such a tiny word, Meghan, carry so much tension? Why did it freeze the atmosphere like a sudden drop in temperature? Why did the energy shift so sharply that even the house manager held his breath? If a greeting can create this much pressure, what does that say about what was waiting beneath the surface? Because this room wasn't just a room. It was a stage, a micro-palace, a controlled environment where Meghan believed she could set the rules, control the hierarchy, and direct the script exactly the way she wanted. But the moment Kaitlyn Greenidge opened her mouth and casually said, "Hi, Meghan," that illusion cracked like porcelain under stress. A tiny crack, yes, but enough to change the atmosphere instantly. Enough to make Meghan's smile tighten. Enough to make her eyes flicker with something she didn't expect to feel that early in the interview. Resistance. And that's where we begin. Because the truth no one wants to admit is this. Meghan Markle is used to orchestrating the environment. She's used to interviews happening on her terms, at her pace, with her framing, her narrative, her emotional arcs. She's used to the world bending slightly for her. People wanting to impress her, wanting her approval, wanting access to the polished, glamorous, royal-adjacent version of herself she presents. But Kaitlyn walked in with no intention of bowing, literally or symbolically. She didn't walk in intimidated. She didn't walk in starstruck. She walked in doing her job, and Meghan wasn't ready for that. The room around them looked expensive in the restrained, curated way people associate with taste. Soft cream walls, delicate gold accents, a faint lavender candle burning on a side table, an arrangement of white peonies placed obviously for aesthetic effect, and the oversized windows letting in cold New York daylight that made the space feel both luxurious and slightly uncomfortable. Meghan sat in a chair positioned strategically near the window, light landing perfectly across her cheekbones, either by coincidence or, more likely, by design. The entire scene was staged like a still from a documentary. Minimalistic, controlled, flattering, intentional. But everything lost its balance with that one greeting. Because Meghan didn't just hear the words, she interpreted them. She read into them. She parsed them like someone listening for subtext. And she found subtext, even if none was meant. Her spine straightened. Her smile stiffened. Her fingers curled slightly inward. A tiny shift, but enough to tell any observant person that she was suddenly uncomfortable. And Kaitlyn, being a journalist who thrives on observing people in their natural state, noticed immediately. Here's the contradiction. Meghan wants to be seen as relatable and down-to-earth, yet she also wants the reverence that comes with royalty. She wants informality, but only when she's the one deciding when it applies. She wants respect, but defined strictly by her own standards. She wants freedom, but she also wants the privileges that come with a title she insists she left behind. So when the house manager announced her like a monarch stepping into a grand hall, Meghan didn't laugh. She didn't dismiss it. She didn't wave it off as over the top. She accepted it. Worse, she expected it. But Kaitlyn didn't play along. She didn't gasp. She didn't bow her head. She didn't pause in awe. She simply said, "Hi, Meghan." And this is where the psychology deepens. Because to Meghan, this wasn't merely a greeting, it was a dismissal of her identity. To her, the title is not just a word, it's armor, it's value, it's legitimacy, it's the anchor that keeps her narrative stitched together. Without it, she's just another former actress navigating Hollywood. With it, she's globally recognized. A duchess, a woman once inside the palace walls. So imagine how that felt when someone walked into the room and didn't validate it. Have you ever noticed how people react when the identity they cling to feels threatened? They stiffen. Their eyes harden. Their tone sharpens. They become less conversational and more defensive without even realizing it. That's exactly what happened to Meghan in that moment. Her entire demeanor shifted by degrees. Not enough for a casual observer to call it dramatic, but enough for someone trained in reading energy to detect something brewing beneath the surface. Kaitlyn felt it instantly. And here's the twist. Kaitlyn didn't back down. Not intentionally. Not defiantly. Simply naturally. Because to her, this was an interview, not a coronation. She wasn't there to validate royalty. She wasn't there to play lady-in-waiting. She was there to talk about the work, the story, the personality behind the public figure. But Meghan wanted something else. The silence after Kaitlyn's greeting lasted barely 2 seconds, but it stretched out like an elastic band pulled tight. The house manager looked almost pained, as if he had rehearsed a moment of grandeur that fizzled the instant it left his lips. Meghan inhaled gently through her nose, repositioning her shoulders as though she were resetting the scene to match her expectations. And then she spoke. "Thank you for coming," she said in a tone so measured, so controlled, that it sounded almost rehearsed. But her eyes communicated something else, a flicker of irritation hidden behind a serene smile. Kaitlyn offered a polite nod, oblivious to the storm quietly forming. Meghan continued, her voice calm but edged with something faintly sharp. "Before we begin, I'd like us to be aligned on how we address each other. That sentence alone would make any journalist raise an eyebrow. Because who says that? Who opens an interview with a request to define forms of address? Who sets linguistic rules before discussion even starts? Unless those rules are tied to a fragile ego rather than protocol. Have you ever walked into a situation where someone tries to re-establish dominance not through actions, but through subtle language cues? Where the rules they set aren't about professionalism, but about status? Where the person across from you suddenly wants to dictate how you perceive them? That's what this was. Meghan wasn't asking for accuracy. She wasn't asking for clarity. She was asking for reinforcement, for affirmation, for reverence. And here's the irony. She didn't realize she was doing it. She believed she was being polite, professional, clear. But the room felt the tension. Kaitlyn kept her expression neutral, almost unreadable. She was used to dealing with complex personalities. She had interviewed celebrities, activists, and public figures with far more intense reputations than Meghan. But this was something new, something almost theatrical. "How would you like me to address you?" she asked calmly. Meghan's reply was soft. Too soft, almost intentionally gentle. "Your Highness is appropriate." 3 words. 3 words that changed the entire trajectory of the interview. Your Highness. In America. In a private room. During an informal one-on-one discussion. In front of a journalist who's known for her grounding, her realism, her commitment to authenticity. Those 3 words did not land the way Meghan thought they would. Not at all. And this is where we enter the deeper layers. The layers that reveal why this interview spiraled the way it did. Because here's the truth. Meghan is caught between 2 worlds, and she wants the privileges of both. She wants the informality of American freedom with the formality of British hierarchy. She wants the autonomy of a celebrity with the reverence of a duchess. She wants to maintain independence while demanding submission. Contradiction after contradiction. It's what makes her fascinating. It's what makes her polarizing. It's what makes this story so compelling. Because the moment she said, "Your Highness," the room changed permanently. And Kaitlyn, in her precise, thoughtful way, responded with something that would tilt the room even further off balance. But that moment, that exact sentence, is the hinge on which the entire interview swings. Because Meghan expected something familiar, something she remembered from palace life. She expected compliance. She expected a correction. She expected the journalist to soften, adjust, obey. She expected the room to bend to her title. But Kaitlyn didn't bend. Instead, she leaned back in her chair with a measured, calm breath, her eyes locking onto Meghan's with the kind of steady clarity that only a seasoned writer possesses. She opened her notebook slowly, the scratch of the cardboard cover opening echoing a little too loudly in the curated silence. And then she said something that would shift the energy so drastically that even Meghan's staff later whispered about it. But before we get to that sentence, that pivotal line, consider this. What happens when a person who depends on validation meets someone who refuses to give it? What happens when a carefully controlled narrative meets an immovable truth? What happens when royalty meets American directness? Those questions hang in the air like a spark waiting for ignition. And then Kaitlyn speaks. Her voice is calm, soft, completely unshaken. And what she says next is the line that would ignite the entire confrontation, the line that would break the room in 2. I'll continue that moment in the next section, but for now, let me leave you right here, right on the edge of the sentence that would change everything. Because what came next would reshape the entire interview, and Meghan never saw it coming. What kind of sentence can flip the energy of a room so completely that even the air feels heavier afterward? That's the question you need to keep in the back of your mind as we pick up exactly where we left off, at the razor-sharp moment before Kaitlyn Greenidge delivered the line that would ripple through the room like a subtle but undeniable earthquake. Because when someone asks to be called Your Highness in a Manhattan apartment, during a private interview, in front of a journalist who doesn't subscribe to royal protocol, something is bound to snap. And snap it did. But before we dive into the explosion, let's pause and ask something directly to you. Have you ever been in a conversation where someone's request suddenly reveals far more about them than they intended? A request that exposes vulnerability disguised as authority? Fragility dressed up as confidence? That's exactly what Meghan unintentionally did when she told Kaitlyn that Your Highness is appropriate. It wasn't just a request. It was a reveal. And Kaitlyn saw it. So when she leaned back in her chair, notebook open, eyes steady, voice calm, she wasn't reacting emotionally or impulsively. She was reacting like someone who understood human behavior. Someone who knew the difference between genuine identity and performative identity. Someone who could sense the insecurity beneath the polished exterior. Then she spoke. "I'm here to interview a woman," she said quietly, "not royalty." 16 words. Not rude. Not disrespectful. Just real. Grounded. American. And those 16 words hit Meghan like a direct blow to the facade she worked so hard to maintain. You could practically feel the temperature shift. You could see the smile freeze on her lips. You could sense the tension clawing its way up her spine. Even the house manager, standing stiffly against the wall, blinked like someone witnessing a moment they knew they weren't supposed to see. Because let's be honest, Meghan expected compliance. She expected the hierarchy she left behind to still apply when convenient. She expected Kaitlyn to adapt, adjust, and fall in line. But Kaitlyn didn't. Not because she was being rebellious. Not because she wanted to challenge Meghan. But because she saw Meghan as a human being, not as royalty. And that's the irony, the twist, the contradiction that fuels the entire tension of this story. Meghan wants to be seen as human, but treated as royal. She wants authenticity, but demands hierarchy. She wants to shed tradition, but cling to privilege. Which one is it? Which identity takes precedence? Which version of herself is the real one? These aren't questions Meghan wants to confront. These are the questions her PR team tries to smooth over. These are the questions she carefully avoids in interviews. But Kaitlyn brought the contradiction right to the surface. And Meghan couldn't hide. Her smile faltered. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but subtly enough that anyone paying attention would notice. Her chin lifted half an inch, the classic microgesture people make when they feel challenged. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, not enough to look angry, but enough to look insulted. And the silence that followed Kaitlyn's sentence stretched long enough to make the room feel tighter. Not royalty. Imagine hearing that when your entire brand, your entire public identity, your entire platform is partially built around the fact that you once married into one of the most famous institutions in the world. Imagine hearing it when you carefully curated a setting meant to reinforce that identity, even privately. Meghan wasn't prepared for it. Not emotionally. Not strategically. Not psychologically. Because here's another contradiction. Meghan left the royal family to seek independence, but being royal is still the most powerful thing about her story. Remove the title, remove the Duchess identity, remove the palace connection, and what remains? A former actress. A woman navigating Hollywood. A public figure surrounded by controversy. She knows that. And Kaitlyn's comment forced her to confront it. So what did Meghan do? She inhaled slowly through her nose. She adjusted her posture. She forced a gentle smile, the kind of smile that says absolutely nothing about how she actually feels. And then she spoke with a tone that was meant to be soft, but came out slightly sharpened. "I was given this title," she said, "and it's part of who I am." That sentence alone was layered. So layered, in fact, that it deserves to be unpacked. I was given this title. Not earned. Given. And it's part of who I am. Not part of who she was. Part of who she is. But is it? Is it truly who she is? Or is it who she needs to be to maintain her relevance in a world that moves quickly, forgets easily, and always looks for the next headline? Kaitlyn gave a small nod, but didn't break eye contact. That's when Meghan continued, her tone shifting into something firmer. "I expect to be addressed appropriately during formal interactions." Formal interactions. In a private room. With no audience. During an interview. The disconnect between Meghan's internal worldview and the external reality couldn't have been clearer. And Kaitlyn noticed it. Her eyebrow raised ever so slightly, a gesture she probably didn't intend to reveal but couldn't quite hide. The house manager shifted his weight, sensing the unease intensifying. Then Kaitlyn said something that made the air thicken further. "With respect, this isn't a formal interaction. This is a conversation between two women." The contrast between Meghan's desire for formality and Kaitlyn's grounding in humanity was stark, almost jarring, because Meghan wasn't used to people neutralizing her status. She was used to people tiptoeing, adjusting themselves, calibrating their behavior to match her expectations. But Kaitlyn didn't calibrate. She set a boundary instead, a boundary that Meghan wasn't ready for. Because if this wasn't formal, then her title wasn't relevant. If her title wasn't relevant, then her authority wasn't inherent. If her authority wasn't inherent, then what was she relying on? And here's where the deeper emotional truth surfaces. Meghan's relationship with her title is tied to her sense of value. It's tied to her worth. It's tied to the image she spent years building, an image that blends humanitarian work, celebrity appeal, and royal status into a single, marketable package. She can't afford for any part of that package to crumble. Not publicly, not privately, which is why Kaitlyn's refusal to use Your Highness wasn't just a disagreement, it was a threat. A subtle one, an unintentional one, but a threat nonetheless. And Meghan reacted accordingly. Her lips pressed together. Her shoulders rose slightly. Her voice dipped into a slightly colder tone, not icy, but frosted enough to signal irritation. Well, Meghan said, I believe respect should be consistent, no matter the setting. And there it was. The pivot. The reframing. The quiet assertion that Kaitlyn's choice of address was rooted not in American journalistic norms, but in disrespect. This is where the power struggle became obvious. Because to Meghan, titles are respect. To Kaitlyn, authenticity is respect. Two different definitions. Two different worlds. Two different expectations colliding in real time. So how did Kaitlyn respond? With a calmness that only deepened the tension. I respect you, she said. But I don't reinforce hierarchies that don't apply here. That sentence landed harder than she expected. Harder than anyone expected. Because that was the moment Meghan's controlled facade began to fracture. The interview hadn't even started, and they were already in a quiet tug-of-war over identity, power, and expectation. And the most fascinating part? Meghan didn't back down. She doubled down. But the moment she did, something else happened. Something that changed the entire direction of the conversation. Something that would push this interview into even more uncomfortable territory. Something that no one in that room was prepared to navigate. Because just as Meghan leaned forward to reestablish control, Kaitlyn picked up her pen, and Meghan noticed. And her reaction to that tiny movement, a simple pen being clicked into place, revealed more about her state of mind than anything she had said out loud. But what happened next would push the tension into a sharper, deeper conflict, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever seen someone react as if a simple, harmless gesture was a threat? That's exactly what happened the moment Kaitlyn Greenidge lifted her pen. A tiny movement, barely noticeable, yet powerful enough to make Meghan's entire posture shift as though she'd been struck. And that raises a question you should keep in mind as we dive into this chapter. Why would someone who claims to be confident, grounded, and fully in control feel threatened by a pen? What was she afraid would be written down? Because Meghan noticed. Instantly, sharply, intensely. Her eyes flicked to the pen like it was a weapon, not a tool. Her expression tightened with a microscopic flinch, a flash of anxiety, irritation, or maybe a deeper fear of being perceived without her permission. That's the thing about Meghan. She wants the world to see her, but only through the lens she carefully polishes. Anything outside her scripted narrative feels dangerous. The pen represented something Meghan couldn't control. Observation, interpretation, documentation, truth, or at least someone else's version of it. And that was enough to unsettle her. Kaitlyn, unaware of the psychological storm she had just triggered, simply clicked the pen and positioned it above her notebook, ready to take notes, the way any journalist would. But to Meghan, this wasn't neutral. It wasn't routine. It wasn't procedural. It was a signal, a shift, a reminder that this interview was not fully hers to steer. The room thickened with tension, the kind that settles quietly but unmistakably into the space between two people who suddenly understand they're not aligned. The house manager, sensing something was wrong again, straightened slightly, likely hoping the interview would find a smoother rhythm. But it wouldn't. Not today. Today was going to be a collision. And that collision started with a question. A simple, clear, direct question from Kaitlyn, asked with complete neutrality. Before we continue, is there something you'd like to clarify about your expectations for this interview? Neutral, polite, measured. But Meghan heard something else entirely. Control slipping. Because Meghan wanted to set the tone. She wanted to define the dynamic. She wanted this environment to operate by the rules of royal protocol. Even though she wasn't in a palace, wasn't in the UK, and wasn't surrounded by courtiers who exist to uphold rituals. She wanted obedience dressed as respect, validation disguised as courtesy. But Kaitlyn refused to bend. So when Kaitlyn asked that question, Meghan's answer came with a touch too much thought, a beat too much silence, a pause that signaled calculation rather than ease. She smoothed the fabric of her dress with one hand, a gesture loaded with the kind of nervousness she'd never admit to. And then she spoke. "I value being addressed correctly," Meghan said slowly, "because I think it reflects professionalism." Professionalism. That word hit the air with a thud. Because here's the contradiction. The request for Your Highness has nothing to do with professionalism. In fact, in American journalism, using such a title would be seen as unprofessional, a breach of neutrality, an unnecessary display of deference. Journalists don't call actors Academy Award winner. They don't call senators the Honorable. They don't call musicians legend. They use names. First names. Last names. Nothing more. But Meghan wanted more. Not for accuracy. Not for clarity. For power. And Kaitlyn understood this. So she responded with honesty, which only intensified the tension. "In my field," Kaitlyn said, "professionalism means treating people equally." Boom. 8 words. 8 words that undercut everything Meghan was trying to build in this room. Treating people equally. Equal. Not above. Not below. Equal. Meghan's lips parted slightly, not in surprise, but in the quiet kind of offense people try to hide behind poise. Her chin lifted, her shoulders squared, and she blinked slowly, trying to reassemble the version of herself she wanted Kaitlyn to see. Then came the moment, the shift, where Meghan unconsciously revealed how deeply the issue cut. "I'm not just any person," she said. There it was. Not just any person. The truth. Not the humanitarian persona. Not the "I'm just like you" persona. Not the "I stepped back from the monarchy" persona. The royal identity. The superior identity. The identity she still clings to with iron grip. And Kaitlyn heard it, felt it, saw it. But instead of confronting it directly, she asked a question, the kind of question that forces truth into the open. "How do you want people to see you, Meghan?" Not Your Highness. Not Duchess. Meghan. A name. A human. A person. It was such a simple question, but loaded with implications. Meghan hesitated, visibly, because she couldn't answer it directly. Not without revealing how tangled her identity has become. She shifted in her chair, crossing her legs with a practiced elegance, buying time to formulate something that sounded thoughtful, composed, purposeful. But the silence exposed the struggle, and Kaitlyn could sense it. Finally, Meghan answered, "I want people to see me for the work I do." Another contradiction. Because if that were entirely true, why would she insist so desperately on being called Your Highness? Kaitlyn gently pressed the point, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but with journalistic clarity. "And does the title help people see the work?" she asked. Meghan froze. A half second. A blink. A tightening at the corner of her mouth. Because the real answer was yes. The title is what gives her interviews weight. The title is what makes headlines. The title is what sets her apart. The title is what gives her access to the elite circles she wants to influence. But she couldn't admit that. Not out loud. Not publicly. Not to a journalist whose pen was now moving, capturing every nuance. So Meghan gave a vague, diplomatic response. "I think it's part of my story. Part of her story. Not her identity. Not her value. Her story. A story she desperately wants to control." But Kaitlyn wasn't finished. She was building towards something. Something sharper, something more revealing, something that would expose Meghan's emotional attachment to the title in a way Meghan hadn't prepared for. "So," Kaitlyn said gently, "is the title for the world, or for you?" There it was. The question Meghan never wanted asked. The question that sliced through the curated calm. And the reaction was instantaneous. Meghan's breath caught. Her fingers twitched slightly. Her gaze hardened into something more defensive, more guarded, more primal. Because the title isn't just for the world. It's for her. For her ego. For her narrative. For her sense of self-worth. She knows it. Kaitlyn sees it. And the room feels it. But Meghan can't admit it. Not without unraveling the identity she has spent years constructing. So she deflects. "That's a complicated question," Meghan said softly. But the softness wasn't warmth. It was armor. Kaitlyn, undeterred, leaned slightly forward, as though trying to bridge the emotional distance Meghan had created. "It doesn't have to be," she said. And that sentence, that gentle challenge, was the point where the interview took a sharp emotional turn. Because Meghan felt cornered, exposed, stripped of the protective layer that her title normally provides. So what did she do? She pivoted. Quickly, strategically, desperately. "I've been through a lot," she said. "People don't understand the pressure. Pressure. A reliable shield. A dependable refuge. A talking point Meghan has used countless times to redirect conversations away from uncomfortable truths. But Kaitlyn didn't let her escape. Not this time. "I understand pressure," Kaitlyn said quietly. "But pressure doesn't define identity. You do." Meghan exhaled sharply, not loudly, but sharply enough for Kaitlyn to notice. Then Meghan did something unexpected. She smiled. A tight, strained, almost brittle smile. The smile someone wears when they're losing a battle they never expected to fight. And then, to reclaim control, she shifted the conversation. But before she could fully redirect the interview, something else happened. Something small, something quick, something subtle, but something that would end up changing the entire trajectory of the conversation. Meghan glanced at Kaitlyn's notebook. She saw a line written. She tried to read it. She couldn't. And her expression shifted again, this time from guarded to uneasy. Because for the first time in the interview, Meghan realized she had no control over what was being documented. And that's the moment, the exact moment, when her calm began to crack. But what happened next, what she said next, and how she tried to regain control would escalate the tension far beyond a disagreement over a title. And no one in that room was ready for it. What kind of person asks for a royal title, then becomes furious when someone refuses to use it? That's the question that slams into the center of this chapter, because the moment Meghan Markle opened her mouth to give Kaitlyn Greenidge that gentle correction, the moment she uttered the words she never should have said in a private American interview, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted from tense to combustible. And it all started with a single sentence that wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, but carried enough weight to collapse the remaining calm between them. "Actually," Meghan said, smoothing the fabric of her dress as if steadying herself, "it's Your Highness." There it was. Not a suggestion, not a preference, a correction, a directive, a demand. And the moment those words left her lips, even she seemed to realize she had stepped into dangerous emotional territory. Because the request didn't fit the environment, and deep down, she knew it. This was not a palace. This was not a gala. This wasn't a royal tour or a diplomatic visit or an official appearance. This was a private interview in New York City, and the expectation that someone should address her with a title typically reserved for royalty within the British monarchy sounded absurd in the quiet reality of that small room. But Meghan needed it. Needed the validation. Needed the hierarchy. Needed the reminder, for herself, more than anyone, that she wasn't just Meghan. Why? Because her entire identity had become a contradiction she couldn't resolve. She wanted freedom without losing status. She wanted independence without losing reverence. She wanted to say she left the royal family, while still using the parts of the royal family that benefited her. This wasn't just a title. It was a lifeline. And Kaitlyn, she saw the contradiction immediately. She didn't react with shock or offense. She reacted with clarity, grounded in simple journalistic logic. She looked up, pen still poised in her hand, her expression neither hostile nor amused, but firm. "I'm here to interview a person," she said calmly. "Not a monarch." A quiet sentence, but devastating. You could almost hear the snap. A subtle, invisible break that cracked directly across Meghan's composure. Her eyes sharpened. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Her shoulders drew back. A defensive posture disguised as elegance. And the silence that followed was suffocating. It wasn't awkwardness. It wasn't hesitation. It was judgment. From Meghan, directed straight at the woman who refused to lower herself into royal protocol. But here's the thing. Meghan didn't want to look angry. She didn't want to look petty. She didn't want to look like the villain in her own story. So she tried, desperately, to soften her voice as she responded. "In formal environments," Meghan said, "the title is expected." The irony? This wasn't formal. Not even remotely. Kaitlyn knew it. The house manager knew it. And deep down, Meghan knew it too. So why insist? Because insisting meant maintaining control. And control is something Meghan cannot function without. But the moment she invoked formality, Kaitlyn's reply cut through it with surgical precision. "This isn't a formal environment," she said gently. "This is a conversation." Another blow. Another reminder. Another refusal to bend. Meghan inhaled sharply, not loudly, but sharply enough that anyone watching closely could feel the irritation rising. Her eyes darted briefly toward the window, as if searching for composure in the cold light flooding the room. Then she delivered the line that revealed everything. "I believe certain titles deserve respect." It wasn't about correctness. It wasn't about professional etiquette. It wasn't even about royal tradition. It was about hierarchy. Titles deserve respect. Therefore, she deserved respect. Therefore, the refusal to use her title was disrespect. For someone who built a public image around empathy, equality, and being just like everyone else, the contradiction was glaring. And Kaitlyn saw the crack widening in real time. So she asked a question, one Meghan wasn't equipped to answer. Respect for the title, or respect for the person? Boom. The room froze again. Meghan blinked. Not slowly. Not gracefully. A startled blink. A caught-off-guard blink. The kind that reveals someone has been hit exactly where they didn't want to be hit. Because if respect is for the title, then Meghan's identity depends on something external, inherited, symbolic, not earned. But if respect is for the person, then the title doesn't matter, and neither does enforcing it. This is the contradiction Meghan cannot fully reconcile in public. She wants to be seen as more than her title, but also needs the title to feel like she is more. So she dodged the question. "It's all connected," she said vaguely. But Kaitlyn wasn't willing to let vague answers slide. Not after the tension that had already built. Not after the Bazaar request to use "Your Highness." So, Kaitlyn pressed gently. "Would you prefer an interview where we focus on your work or your rank?" Meghan stiffened. Her eyes flashed with something close to frustration. "My rank is part of my work." There it was. Another reveal. Another truth slipping out. Another contradiction exposed. Because Meghan has publicly said, repeatedly, that titles do not define her. She has positioned herself as modern, liberated, progressive, uninterested in royal hierarchy. And yet here, in a private room, she insisted the title is the work. Which one is the truth? The version she tells the public? Or the version she enforces in private? Kaitlyn's pen scratched quietly across the page. And the sound was enough to make Meghan's jaw tighten. She wasn't just annoyed. She was threatened. Threatened by what might be written down. Threatened by what might be interpreted. Threatened by the fact that she couldn't control the narrative in this room the way she controls it in interviews designed for sympathetic media outlets. Then she leaned forward, voice dropping into a tone so controlled it almost sounded brittle. "I worked hard to build this identity," Meghan said. "And I expect people to acknowledge it. Worked hard to build an identity based on a title given through marriage, not earned through labor, not created through accomplishments, but gained through circumstance." Kaitlyn saw the contradiction again, so she asked another question, one sharp enough to pierce the emotional armor Meghan had been trying to rebuild. "Is your identity something you built, or something you married into?" The silence that followed wasn't just silence. It was impact. Shock. Humiliation. Rage simmering beneath the surface. Meghan stared at Kaitlyn, her face still, her fingers clasped tightly together, her breath shallow, because Kaitlyn had said the one thing Meghan could not emotionally tolerate, the one question she could not dismiss, the one truth she could not control. "Both," Meghan managed to say, voice thin. "It's both." But the look in her eyes said otherwise. It wasn't both. It wasn't equal. It wasn't balanced. Her title, the identity she clung to, came from marriage. And defiance from a journalist who refused to use that title was an emotional threat she didn't know how to process. That's why, in that moment, Meghan transitioned from irritated to defensive to something far more volatile. She leaned back, repositioned herself, forced her expression into a mask of calm, but her voice shook slightly as she spoke next. "Let's just continue the interview." But Kaitlyn didn't move, didn't flip her page, didn't resume questioning. Instead, she asked something that would escalate the tension to its highest point yet, the question that would ignite Meghan's anger fully, the question that would push her from mere irritation into outright fury. Before we continue, Kaitlyn said, I need to know something clearly. Meghan blinked. Of course. Do you want honesty? Kaitlyn asked, or validation? Meghan froze. Her body went motionless. Her expression blank. Her eyes hard. Because for the first time in the interview, someone had named the tension directly. Someone had cut through the performance. Someone had exposed the need Meghan had been trying so desperately to disguise. And Meghan didn't know how to respond. Not immediately. Not gracefully. Not convincingly. She hesitated. And in that hesitation, everything about her posture, her expression, her energy shifted. She was no longer the controlled duchess. No longer the poised interview subject. No longer the image she had tried to construct. She was a person caught, exposed, cornered. So when she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but not gentle. I want respect, she said. But Kaitlyn saw the truth hiding behind the word. Meghan didn't want respect. She wanted deference. And the difference between the two was about to turn this confrontation into something far worse, something neither of them could walk away from easily. Because Meghan's next move, the one she made in response to this uncomfortable question, would reveal her most fragile insecurity yet. And what came next would change everything, and no one in that room saw it coming. What does someone really mean when they say, I want respect? Because that's the exact moment everything in the room changed. The moment Meghan Markle uttered those 3 words in a voice that was too soft, too tight, too controlled to match the fury simmering underneath. Respect. A word that sounds noble on the surface, but in this room, in this tense, airless space, it meant something completely different. And Kaitlyn Greenidge knew it. She saw the contradiction in Meghan's eyes, the mismatch between what she said and what she wanted. Because respect means equality. But that's not what Meghan was fighting for. She wasn't fighting for mutual respect. She was fighting for hierarchy, for acknowledgement, for superiority, for being treated like royalty, even after choosing to leave the institution that granted her that title in the first place. But here's the uncomfortable truth about hierarchy. It only works when everyone agrees to participate. And in this tiny room in New York, only one person wanted it. Kaitlyn didn't. And that refusal, that quiet, unflinching refusal, pushed Meghan into the next emotional stage of this entire confrontation. So when she said, I want respect, what she really meant was, I want compliance. And Kaitlyn felt that, felt the shift, felt the expectation. So she leaned back, calm as ever, letting the silence bloom between them like a tense, expanding bubble that neither of them dared to pop too quickly. It wasn't that she was being confrontational. She wasn't. She was giving Meghan space to clarify, to explain, to justify the demand. But Meghan didn't take that space. She didn't explain. She didn't justify. She didn't soften. Instead, she crossed her legs slowly, deliberately, and lifted her chin, giving herself height, a subtle physical gesture signaling an attempt to reclaim dominance. Her eyes narrowed just enough to reveal a flicker of irritation she couldn't hide anymore. Her voice, when it finally emerged again, was barely above a whisper, but full of tension. When someone is given a title, Meghan said, it should be honored. There it was. The truth she had tried to wrap in indirect language finally slipped through. This wasn't about respect. This was about honor, recognition, obligation. It was about the invisible hierarchy she believed should still exist around her, even here, in America, in a room with 3 people in it. During an interview meant to highlight her humanitarian work, titles should be honored. As if the United States, a country built on rejecting monarchy, should instinctively defer to her. Kaitlyn didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't soften. She simply tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable, and said something that made Meghan's entire face flush with surprise. Honor is earned, Kaitlyn replied quietly. Not requested. That was the line. The moment the tension snapped. The moment Meghan's patience, already stretched thin, finally tore. Her eyes widened, not in shock, but in indignation. She leaned forward, voice tightening in a way that betrayed the anger her expression tried to mask. I think it's inappropriate, she said, to disregard tradition. Tradition, in a rented apartment, during a private American interview, with a journalist who had no obligation, culturally, historically, legally, or ethically, to adhere to royal titles at all. Kaitlyn exhaled slowly, controlled, thoughtful. Tradition, she said softly, is chosen, not enforced. And that sentence wasn't disrespect, it was truth. Real American truth. But to Meghan, in that moment, it was rebellion. You could see the shift in her body language as the weight of that sentence landed. She shifted back in her chair, her arms folding loosely in front of her, a defensive posture disguised as poise. Her foot tapped once, quickly, betraying agitation she hadn't shown earlier. Her lips pressed into a thin, firm line, the kind someone holds when they are struggling to stay composed. And then her voice changed. It deepened slightly, grew cooler, more controlled, more pointed. "Are you trying to disrespect me?" she asked. There it was, the accusation she had been building toward since the moment Kaitlyn refused to use her title. But Kaitlyn didn't take the bait. She answered calmly, directly, without hesitation. "No," she said. "I'm trying to be accurate." Accuracy. Fairness. Journalistic integrity. Values that should be universally respected, but in this moment, they collided directly with Meghan's need for reverence. Her need to be seen as more than an interview subject, more than a public figure, more than a former royal. She needed the title because without it, she felt exposed. Ordinary. Human. And the truth? Being human, fully human, is what Meghan struggles with most. Because being human doesn't come with protocol or privilege. It doesn't come with announced entrances or controlled narratives. It doesn't come with titles people are obligated to use. Being human requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is the one thing Meghan refuses to show when she isn't directing the scene. So she doubled down. "It's not inaccurate," Meghan insisted, her voice firmer now. "It's my title." "Legally, yes," Kaitlyn replied. "Culturally, not here." This was the crack that widened into a chasm. Because Meghan has always marketed herself as culturally fluent, as someone who can navigate different spaces with grace. But in this moment, she was demanding a British hierarchical ritual from an American journalist who had every right not to comply. And the contradiction was too glaring to ignore. Meghan tried again. Her voice was crisp, almost scolding. "It's still proper etiquette." "British etiquette," Kaitlyn corrected softly. Meghan's jaw tightened. And in that tiny tightening, in that small but undeniable gesture, you could see the shift from defensiveness to something far sharper. Because Meghan wasn't just irritated, she was offended. And then the anger arrived. It didn't erupt loudly. It didn't explode dramatically. It arrived quietly, like a shadow spreading across her expression, tightening her posture, cooling her voice into something dangerously close to contempt. "I don't appreciate being challenged like this," Meghan said. Kaitlyn didn't blink. "I'm not challenging you," she replied. "I'm clarifying the environment we're in." "The environment," Meghan snapped, "is one of respect." "Mutual respect," Kaitlyn said. And that word, mutual, was the final strike. Mutual meant equal. Mutual meant shared. Mutual meant no hierarchy. Mutual meant no royal treatment. Mutual was the one thing Meghan could not accept in this moment. She leaned forward again. No longer composed, no longer performing serenity, no longer masking her irritation. And her voice trembled with restrained anger. "You're being dismissive." "I'm being consistent," Kaitlyn replied quietly. Silence. Cold, dense silence. The house manager looked like he wished he could vanish. The air felt thick with unspoken resentment. Meghan inhaled a long, shaky breath, her eyes narrowing into something sharper, something colder, something unmistakably furious. And then, in the moment her composure fully cracked, she spoke the words that would send the interview spiraling into open conflict. "If you won't address me correctly," Meghan said, her voice trembling with anger she could no longer mask, "then we can't continue." That was it. The walk-off threat. The ultimatum. The line drawn in the sand. But Kaitlyn didn't flinch, didn't fold, didn't apologize. Instead, she calmly closed her notebook halfway. Not fully, not aggressively, but enough to signal she was willing to walk away too. "Then maybe we shouldn't," she said. Meghan's mouth opened slightly, stunned. This wasn't the plan. This wasn't the dynamic she expected. This wasn't the power she thought she had. "You're threatening to leave?" Meghan asked, voice cracking with disbelief and anger. "No," Kaitlyn said. "I'm saying I won't compromise truth for protocol." Silence again. Longer this time. Heavier. more dangerous. Because in that silence, Meghan realized something she had been trying to avoid from the moment she demanded the title. She had lost control, and she needed to get it back, desperately. Which is why the next thing she did, the next thing she said, was not calm, not strategic, not measured. It was pure emotion, pure frustration, pure fear, pure ego, and it would ignite the interview into a new, more volatile phase, one that neither woman could walk away from unchanged. Because what Meghan said next would push this tension past the point of return, and what came after would shock even her own staff. Have you ever seen someone realize they're losing control and scramble, not gracefully, not strategically, but emotionally, to claw it back? That's exactly what happened the moment Meghan Markle felt the ground tilt beneath her in that private New York room. Because when Kaitlyn Greenidge calmly pushed back, refusing to compromise honesty for protocol, Meghan wasn't just irritated anymore. She wasn't just offended. She was exposed. And when someone who depends on narrative control feels exposed, the reaction isn't logical, it's primal. So the next words that came out of Meghan's mouth didn't sound like a duchess, or an activist, or a media-savvy public figure. They sounded like someone fighting for the last shred of authority in a room she thought she ruled. "You're twisting everything I say," Meghan snapped. The words hung in the air like static, electrifying the tension that had been building for the past 15 minutes. It wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It was an accusation, a claim, a warning. And Kaitlyn's response was the worst possible thing Meghan could have heard in that moment. "I'm repeating your words," Kaitlyn said quietly. Direct, calm, neutral, devastating. Because nothing destabilizes someone clinging to power more than a calm refusal to be intimidated. The house manager shifted again, eyes darting between the two women as though trying to calculate which one might explode first. The room felt smaller, tighter, almost claustrophobic, as if the very walls were leaning in to watch the escalating conflict. And Meghan? She felt it. She felt the loss of control like a physical sensation, a tightening in her chest, a heat rising up the back of her neck, a trembling under her voice that she fought to hide. Because here's the truth no one ever says out loud. Meghan's entire public identity relies on her ability to control the narrative. She controls the setting. She controls the lighting. She controls the questions, the angles, the emotions, the framing. But in this small apartment, with one journalist and one house manager, she had none of that. And it terrified her. So she turned to the one strategy she believed would re-establish dominance: moral framing. "You're being intentionally difficult," Meghan said, her voice growing firmer. "I'm trying to have a meaningful conversation." But Kaitlyn didn't budge. "I'm trying to have one too," she replied. "But a conversation is based on clarity, not titles." That sentence hit Meghan like a direct hit to her ego. Because clarity meant honesty. Honesty meant dropping the performance. Dropping the performance meant vulnerability. And vulnerability was the last thing she was willing to show. So she leaned forward, choosing a new tactic, one she had used successfully in interviews where journalists were sympathetic, compliant, eager to flatter. "Women should support each other," Meghan said. Another emotional tactic. Another pivot. Another attempt at framing Kaitlyn as the unreasonable one. But Kaitlyn saw right through it. "Yes," she said, "and support includes honesty." Honesty. There it was again, appearing in this interview like a stone thrown through a glass window. Meghan's jaw tightened. Because everything she didn't want to confront in this moment, the contradictions, the fragility, the need for reverence, the dependence on a title, was being reflected back at her by someone she couldn't dismiss, couldn't silence, couldn't intimidate. Suddenly, Meghan shifted strategy again, this time into something more emotional, more dramatic, more personal. "I've been attacked for years," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "People tear me apart for every little thing. It wasn't manipulative, not fully. It was real, but weaponized. A truth, but used to shift blame. A tactic, but rooted in genuine wounds." And Kaitlyn didn't dismiss it. She didn't belittle it. She didn't roll her eyes or push back with skepticism. She simply asked a question that pierced straight through the emotional theatrics to the core of the issue. "And how does being called Your Highness change that?" Meghan blinked. Her breath caught. The question was too blunt, too clear, too true. Because the answer was, it didn't. It never did. It never could. A title can't stop criticism. A title can't stop speculation. A title can't stop public scrutiny. But a title can shield the ego. And that's what this was really about. So Meghan deflected again, lifting her chin in that familiar